On a calm Friday night in Melbourne, an Emirates Airbus A340 rolled onto the runway for what should have been a routine departure to Dubai. Nearly 300 passengers and crew were on board, expecting a long but uneventful 14-hour flight. The weather was perfect, the runway was clear, and the 4 powerful engines were ready. Nothing about the scene suggested that this aircraft was seconds away from disaster. As the jet accelerated, the cabin felt the familiar push into the seats. But as the runway lights rushed closer, something felt wrong. The first officer pulled back on the controls, waiting for the nose to rise. It didn't. He pulled again. Still nothing. The end of the runway was approaching fast, and the massive aircraft refused to leave the ground. Suddenly, the nose lifted, but the body of the plane stayed flat. In the next terrifying moment, the tail slammed into the runway. Sparks exploded into the night, sending a red glow flashing through the cabin windows. Passengers screamed as the sound of grinding metal echoed through the aircraft. The plane was running out of runway, speed increasing, options disappearing. This was Emirates Flight 407, and what unfolded next had little to do with engines or weather. Instead, it would become a chilling lesson in human psychology, distraction, and how a single unnoticed error can nearly bring down a modern airliner. Earlier that evening, 257 passengers and 18 crew had boarded the 5-year-old Airbus A340-500 at Melbourne Airport. Designed for ultra-long-haul flights, the aircraft had an excellent safety record and enough range to reach Dubai non-stop. Because of the flight's length, 4 pilots were assigned, a captain, a first officer, and 2 relief pilots who would later take over during cruise. All 4 pilots were highly experienced, with thousands of flight hours on Airbus wide-body jets. Yet on this night, experience would quietly turn into a hidden threat, setting the stage for one of Australia's most technology and human judgment. Inside the cockpit, the atmosphere before departure was busy and crowded. Along with the 4 pilots, 2 ground engineers were present, filling the limited space with conversation and movement. One of the relief pilots even had to wait outside the cockpit due to the lack of room. This seemingly harmless congestion would later play a critical role. As part of routine preparations, the first officer entered key performance data into the aircraft's electronic flight bag, a tablet used to calculate takeoff speeds, engine thrust, and flap settings. While typing the aircraft's takeoff weight, his finger slipped. Instead of entering the correct value, he mistakenly typed a weight that was nearly 100 tons lighter than the aircraft actually was. This single error caused the system to calculate dangerously low takeoff speeds, insufficient engine thrust, and incorrect flap configuration. On its own, the mistake was serious, but aviation safety relies on layers of cross-checks meant to catch exactly this kind of problem. The captain took the tablet to verify the numbers. But during his review, a comment from someone else in the cockpit distracted him. When he looked back, he believed he had already completed his checks. The incorrect figures went unnoticed. Next, the captain entered these flawed values into the aircraft's flight management computer. Normally, the pilots would verbally confirm that the weight in the tablet matched the weight written on the flight plan. That confirmation never happened. As boarding finished and the doors closed, the error slipped deeper into the system. None of the numbers looked obviously wrong, especially to pilots familiar with the smaller Airbus A340 where similar values were common. The mistake blended in perfectly. With engines started and clearance received, Flight 407 began taxiing toward the runway. Unaware of what lay ahead, The crew was now just minutes away from discovering the consequences of one small input error. As the aircraft taxied toward runway 16, the first officer controlled the jet while the captain worked through the before takeoff checklist. Based on the incorrect calculations, the flaps were set to a lower position than required for such a heavy aircraft. With less wing surface exposed, the plane would generate far less lift during takeoff. At 10:30 p.m., Flight 407 lined up on the runway. The city lights shimmered in the distance as the first officer advanced the thrust levers to a reduced power setting known as flex. This setting is commonly used to protect engines, but only when performance margins allow it. Tonight, they did not. The four engines roared, and the 360-ton aircraft began its takeoff roll. Acceleration felt sluggish, but nothing alarming. The Airbus A340 was known for being slow to build speed, and the pilots had experienced similar takeoffs before. 100 knots, the captain called out. The aircraft thundered forward, crossing into the high-speed phase where aborting a takeoff was no longer safe. Moments later, they passed V1, the point of no return. Whatever happened next, the aircraft had to fly. Then came rotation speed. The first officer gently pulled back on the side stick, expecting the nose to rise. It didn't. He applied more input. Still nothing. The runway lights were racing toward them, and the end was frighteningly close. The speeds they were using were wrong, calculated for an aircraft far lighter than reality. The jet simply wasn't ready to fly. The crew was about to learn that the margin between flight and catastrophe had vanished. With the runway disappearing beneath them, the captain ordered the first officer to pull back again. This time, the nose finally lifted, but the aircraft refused to climb. The altitude indicator stayed frozen at 0. Despite the raised nose, the massive jet remained glued to the ground. The first officer pulled harder. The nose pitched higher, far beyond normal takeoff attitude. Then came the impact. The tail struck the runway with violent force, spraying sparks into the night as metal scraped against asphalt at nearly 300 km/h. Inside the cabin, passengers saw a terrifying red glow flash past their windows. Some smelled burning metal. Others screamed, convinced the aircraft was about to explode. The strike was so severe that parts of the aircraft's underside were torn open. A flight recorder was dislodged from its mounting. Yet the plane was still accelerating, racing toward the end of the runway with no room left. In a final, desperate move, the captain slammed the thrust levers forward to maximum power. The engines surged, pushing the damaged aircraft beyond its limits. The jet burst past the runway threshold, plowing through soft ground and striking navigation equipment. For a brief moment, it seemed certain the aircraft would crash into the darkness beyond the airport. Then, almost impossibly, the main wheels lifted off the ground. Barely airborne, Flight 407 staggered into the sky, trailing damage and shock behind it. The worst had been avoided, but the emergency was far from over. The aircraft climbed painfully slowly, struggling to gain altitude. Warning messages lit up the cockpit screens, including a clear alert confirming what the crew already feared, a tail strike. From the control tower, controllers had seen the shower of sparks and immediately radioed the pilots to confirm visible damage. The crew knew instantly this flight was over. Dubai was no longer an option. Their only priority now was keeping the aircraft airborne and bringing it back to Melbourne. But another serious problem quickly became clear. The aircraft was extremely heavy, carrying more than 130 tons of fuel. This placed it far above the maximum safe landing weight. Attempting to land like this could collapse the landing gear or cause further structural damage, especially with an already compromised tail. Air traffic control cleared Flight 407 to climb to 7,000 feet and directed it out over the ocean. There, the crew could dump fuel safely while remaining close to the airport in case conditions worsened. Adrenaline filled the cockpit. The captain knew that without the last-second decision to apply full thrust, the aircraft would almost certainly have crashed beyond the runway. But there was no time to reflect. Every action now mattered. As the first officer reached for the electronic flight bag to calculate fuel dumping and landing performance, he froze. On the screen was the same takeoff page from earlier, and the incorrect weight entry stared back at him. In that moment, the truth became unavoidable. A single wrong number had nearly killed everyone on board. The first officer didn't have time to dwell on the realization. Another problem emerged almost immediately. One of the relief pilots noticed that the aircraft was failing to pressurize properly. The cabin altitude wasn't stabilizing as expected. The reason soon became terrifyingly clear. When the tail scraped along the runway, the friction had worn through the aircraft's outer skin. Multiple holes had formed near the rear of the fuselage. The jet was no longer airtight. Understanding the seriousness of the situation, the captain declared a PAN, the international urgency call, alerting air traffic control that they required priority handling. Emergency vehicles were dispatched, and the runway was inspected. Moments later, controllers reported disturbing findings. Pieces of aircraft skin, damaged lights, and parts of navigation equipment were scattered near the end of the runway. The damage was extensive. Meanwhile, the pilots faced a critical decision. To land safely, they needed to reduce weight, but not so much that they'd be unable to attempt another approach if needed. After careful discussion, they chose to dump 80 tons of fuel. This would still leave the aircraft overweight, but with enough fuel for contingencies. This time, there would be no shortcuts. The pilots independently calculated landing performance using multiple sources, double and triple checking every number. The lesson had been learned the hardest possible way. As fuel streamed from the wings into the dark ocean below, Flight 407 circled near Melbourne, wounded, heavy, and racing against time. As fuel dumping continued, the captain kept the aircraft close to Melbourne, unwilling to stray far with so many unknowns. Inside the cockpit, tension remained high. The only confirmation of damage on their screens was a simple warning message, nothing that truly explained how badly the aircraft had been hurt. To gain clarity, the captain called the lead flight attendant to the cockpit. He asked what the cabin crew had observed during takeoff. The answer was unsettling. Flight attendants and passengers in the rear had heard loud scraping sounds, felt violent vibrations, and smelled something burning. Some had seen sparks flashing past the windows. The situation appeared stable for the moment. Fuel dumping was completed just after 11:25 p.m., and the crew began preparing for their return. The plan was to land as soon as possible. Then, during the descent, a low rumbling noise echoed through the aircraft. Before the pilots could identify the source, an urgent call came from the cabin. There was smoke. Flight attendants reported seeing and smelling smoke near the rear of the aircraft. The word no pilot ever wants to hear had been spoken. A fire on board changes everything. The captain immediately abandoned the planned approach and ordered an urgent return to the airport. The first officer informed air traffic control, requesting an immediate landing clearance. With a damaged aircraft, overweight condition, and now possible fire, Flight 407 was entering its most dangerous phase yet. Time was no longer on their side. With smoke reported in the cabin, the crew knew they might have less than 20 minutes before conditions became uncontrollable. Air traffic control cleared them for an immediate approach, and emergency services were positioned along the runway. Due to their position in the sky, the pilots abandoned the original landing direction and chose a straight-in approach to the opposite runway. This decision added another challenge, a tailwind. Landing with a tailwind meant higher speed, longer stopping distance, and greater stress on an already damaged aircraft. The cockpit became laser-focused. The captain flew while the first officer handled radio calls and checklists. Landing configuration was carefully set, knowing that any mistake now could be fatal. The lead flight attendant was instructed to prepare the cabin for a possible emergency evacuation. Below them, the runway lights came into view. The same runway environment they had barely escaped earlier now awaited their return. The aircraft was still heavier than recommended, and braking performance would be critical. As the landing gear extended, the pilots listened closely for abnormal sounds. Every vibration felt amplified. The fear wasn't just about landing, it was whether the aircraft would stay intact long enough to stop. Moments later, Flight 407 crossed the runway threshold, descending toward a landing that would decide the fate of everyone on board. At 11:36 p.m., the damaged Airbus floated just above the runway lights. The captain held the aircraft steady, fully aware that they were landing faster and heavier than planned. There would be no second chance. The wheels touched down firmly. Instantly, the captain applied maximum braking while deploying reverse thrust. The engines roared as the aircraft fought to slow down. Inside the cabin, passengers were pressed forward in their seats, many bracing for impact. For a terrifying moment, it seemed history might repeat itself. The end of the runway rushed closer as the heavy jet continued rolling. Every meter mattered. Emergency vehicles raced alongside, prepared for the worst. Then, finally, the aircraft began to decelerate rapidly. The speed dropped. The remaining runway disappeared beneath the nose, and the jet came to a complete stop just before the pavement ended. Silence followed. Fire crews rushed in, scanning the aircraft for flames. Despite earlier reports of smoke, there was no active fire. Against all odds, the aircraft was intact enough to keep everyone alive. All 257 passengers and 18 crew members had survived. For the pilots, relief mixed with shock. Less than an hour earlier, they had come within seconds of one of the worst aviation disasters in Australian history. Now, the nightmare was over, but the consequences were only beginning. Later that night, as passengers were taken to terminals and hotels, the true scale of the damage became clear. Investigators found deep scrapes along the aircraft's underside, torn fuselage skin, and destroyed runway equipment scattered beyond the threshold. The aircraft had survived by the smallest possible margin. In the days that followed, attention turned to the cockpit. Investigators confirmed that the entire chain of events began with a single incorrect weight entry into the electronic flight bag. Distractions, overcrowding in the cockpit, and missed verbal crosschecks allowed the error to pass through every safety barrier. The presence of 4 pilots, normally an added layer of protection, failed to help. One relief pilot couldn't access a second tablet, while the other wasn't present during the critical calculations. Compounding the issue, all the incorrect figures looked believable, especially to pilots accustomed to flying lighter Airbus models. The incident sent shockwaves through the aviation industry. Airlines revised procedures, requiring independent takeoff calculations by two pilots. Aircraft software was updated to warn crews when takeoff performance numbers were insufficient for the available runway. Emirates Flight 407 never became a crash headline, but it became something just as important, a warning. A reminder that even in modern aviation, technology cannot protect against human error unless discipline, focus, and communication are maintained. That night in Melbourne, nearly 300 lives were saved, not by luck alone, but by a final moment of decisive action that pulled a broken aircraft back from the edge of catastrophe.